Hello guys, today we are going to be looking at asynchronous JavaScript. So what exactly does asynchronous in JavaScript actually mean? So it just means not happening at the same time. That's what it means. It's like saying do this task but don't wait for it to finish before moving on, and then we'll check back later once it's done. Something like that. So that's asynchronous. Things like fetching data from a server, or waiting for a user to click on a button or something, or even reading a file. So things like this will take time. Okay, and if JavaScript would wait, that means working with synchronous, our whole application would freeze until each of these tasks are finished, and that's not the ideal way to build an application. So the essence of, I'm going to demonstrate asynchronous JavaScript by fetching data from an online source. So this source now, we call it an API. An API just stands for Application Programming Interface. So an API is a software that connects two existing softwares together. That's what it does. So think of building a dictionary, for instance, where we need to get words, right? Get their meanings, get their transcriptions, get their synonyms and antonyms. Now, one way we could do it is we need to gather all these words together, possibly in objects, and store them in an array. Or we could already use what someone else has done. Now that's the API is coming. So an API is that software that has already been built for this. All we need to do is properly integrate it into our own existing application. Okay, so I'm going to fetch product now. I'm going to fetch product from an API. So the first thing that we do every time we want to fetch product in this case is to create a function whose sole purpose is to fetch this product. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it fetch product, just like that. And this function, I'm going to make it a callback function. So like I said, the sole purpose of this function now is to fetch data from an API. Okay. So since I know that this function is going to be interacting directly with an API, because by default, this is basic synchronous programming, okay? I need to ensure that I mark this function as asynchronous, basically telling JavaScript, okay, allow this function to fetch data from an API. And if there are other processes afterwards, run those processes till this guy is ready. So with introducing the async as a keyword now, I've been able to ensure that fetch product is an asynchronous function. And that's how that one is done. Okay? So the next thing we're going to do now is, I'm going to create a variable to store a value. Now that value I'm going to store is what we call an endpoint. So an endpoint is actually where we make our request to whenever we point to an API. And by request, I just mean asking for data or asking for information. Okay, so every time we send a request to an API, we are actually pointing to what we call an endpoint. So the API of choice we are going to be using today is called fix.api.com. So I'm going to click on docs. Let's view the documentation. And after taking a look at this, I can tell that this link here, at this part of the screen, is actually my endpoint. So what I'm going to do is, I'll create a variable for that, call that variable URL, and store that value as a string in here. So whenever I make requests, I'm actually pointing to this endpoint in URL. Okay. The next thing we need to do whenever we are dealing with asynchronous functions is, since we know that these APIs are basically online, right? They are online. We need to ensure that we structure our code such that whenever the API, or whenever we are offline trying to send a request to the API, our entire application will not crash. Now that's where the try-catch block of code comes in. Try-catch block of code just says this. So these are two blocks. There is a try block and there is a catch block. The try block, I'll just leave a comment here, is the code to run whenever our fetch request is successful. When fetch is successful. Basically meaning, whenever we send out a request to the API and the API receives a request, whatever we specify in the try block is going to run. Then the catch block is now the code to run when our fetch is unsuccessful. So things like my computer being offline, sending a request, that means my fetch is going to be unsuccessful because the API would not receive it. Okay? So I would always start with my catch block, and the first thing I'm going to do is, the error specified in this block of code is the error message being returned. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to send that error message to my console as an error. So I'm going to write console.error. and specify that I'm sending the error that is coming from there. After that, to keep my users in the loop, I will send out an alert to let them know that an error occurred. So with this now, I know that whenever my fetch is not successful, I should be able to handle it from here. So once I see the alert that says an error occurred, as a developer now, I would ensure, or rather, I would just know that on my console is the main error message, and then I check it out. Okay, so let's get into writing our function. So having stored our endpoint in a URL now, the next thing we need to do is we now need to make a request to this endpoint. So our first step is to create a variable that will hold the value that would come from the API. So I'll call that variable rather, data. And let me make it a constant just so I won't be able to change it. So data now is going to be equal to something. Now this is where fetching actually comes in, where we use the fetch keyword as a function. So then I specify that I am sending a request to my URL already specified. That's it. So what I need to do now is I need to send data to my console, just so we'll see what it is like coming from the API. Okay, so when I refresh my page now, oh, I've not called my function yet. So I have to call the function. So I'll just call it here, fetch product as a function. So when I refresh, I get to see what we call a promise. Now a promise is a way of telling us that, okay, your request has been successfully sent, hence fulfilled. And a promise is now saying, don't worry, I promise you I'm going to give you a response. Whether that response is we have what you're looking for or not, the point is a response is being assured at this point. So in order to stop us from getting to see that promise, we have to pass in the await as a keyword here. What await does here is, await is telling JavaScript, wait for whatever is coming from the API. Wait patiently for it. So once I refresh the page now, observe, no longer promise. What I'm rather seeing is something else. Something else here, okay? Now, every time we send a request and API and the API responds, the API would always give us a response in JSON formats. I left here as a comment, a JSON format. JSON just means JavaScript Object Notation. It's a lightweight version of JavaScript, basically that allows us move data via the internet, JSON. My next step now, having understood that data is in JSON format, is to convert the JSON format to regular JavaScript that I can understand. And once again, I'm going to create a variable for that. I'll call it res. So this variable now is going to be data.json. So this is how we convert it. JSON, yes, as a function. Okay, so I want to send res now to my console. Once I do that and I refresh, you then realize that another promise is here. So just like we saw earlier on, so that I won't keep seeing the promise, I'm going to wait for it. Once again with the await keyword. Once I wait for it, I get to see my regular JavaScript that I can relate with. So I know that this is an array of 20 objects. Now, I need to address why we are getting an array here. Every time we send a request to an API, and what we are receiving is not a single product or one data, what happens is JavaScript is going to put everything in an array, because that's the JavaScript way of saying what you are requesting for is more than one, therefore have it this way. So that's why if you observe, what we have here is an array of multiple objects. So these objects are actually coming from our endpoint, and everything together is an array. So that is asynchronous JavaScript.